Following the French expedition to Egypt in 1798, the centuries-old distribution of power in the Middle East was turned upside down. As European supremacy grew, a group of Egyptian intellectuals banded together and formed a reactionary movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. They aimed to reform society without surrendering religious customs. And what ensued was an intellectual battle for national identity that quickly transformed into an armed resistance. So let's talk about the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's episode is made possible by NordVPN. If you want to reduce your digital footprint, check out NordVPN. It's affordable, user-friendly, and it works on mobile devices as well. Go to nordvpn.com/CaspianReport and use the promo code CaspianReport to get a discount on the premium version. Having dislodged the Ottomans from Egypt, it was clear that the powerhouses of Europe had the upper hand in terms of science, military, prosperity, governance, pretty much every category imaginable. Over the course of the 19th century, as the footprint of Britain and France expanded across the Middle East, ancient borders were redrawn, communities were relocated, and some segments of Muslim societies took up newly crafted identities. Simultaneously, new ideas, inspired by European practices, surfaced across the Islamic world, including nationalism, secularism, capitalism, and so on. Nowhere was this influence more felt than in Egypt. From the perspective of the Europeans, their activities were not out of the ordinary. The distribution of power and influence had always been a back-and-forth trade. But from the point of view of the local Muslim communities, they were under siege by European civilization. As such, reactionary movements emerged that sought to reform Islamic societies without abandoning their traditions. It was a confusing time where contradictory practices and customs struggled for ideological dominance. On the one hand, there were European concepts such as liberalism, humanism, modernity, etc. On the other side were Islamic intellectuals who argued for reform without surrendering their religious virtues. Both sides wanted to change, and the result was an intellectual battle for identity. It is in this upsetting environment that many religious dogmas developed, including Pan-Islamism, Salafism, Wahhabism, etc. One of the champions in these ideological encounters was Jamaluddin al-Afghani, a revolutionary scholar from Afghanistan who had served as an advisor to kings and sultans alike. His ideas argued for modern governments that were accountable and governed according to the rule of law. Al-Afghani took a strong stance against corruption, and wherever he went, he stirred up the public's imagination. Though he was unsuccessful in his venture, the influence of al-Afghani went well beyond national borders and even time. His work strongly influenced the succeeding generation of Islamic reactionary factions, scholars, and activists. Among them was Hassan Al-Banna from Egypt. Through a series of unforeseen events, he would establish one of the earliest reactionary groups called the Muslim Brotherhood. But before we go any further with the endeavors of Al-Banna, we need to look at the precarious situation of his time. Sitting at the epicenter of revolution, Egypt was a country torn by change. Britain and France had far-reaching interests in Egypt because they were working to connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea by constructing a canal across the Suez region. It was a colossal project, one that required British and French business tycoons, lawmakers, technocrats, engineers, and so on to attend on site. A wave of European immigrants flocked to the Suez region, whereby the technicians brought their families with them. Over time, as the Suez Canal was being constructed, a unique communal situation emerged on the ground. New towns had been set up to accommodate the workers, including the facilities that come with urban life. However, these towns were segregated. One side of the canal had a European culture with luxurious housing, cafeterias, theaters, etc. The other side, meanwhile, retained its Islamic character with bazaars, tea shops, barber houses, etc., though poverty was widespread. This segregated state of affairs lasted well after the completion of the Suez Canal. When the canal opened for business in 1869, the French and British communities stayed on site. They had grown a liking to their life in Egypt. For the Egyptians, the circumstances had become less favorable. Nearly all commercial vessels preferred to do their business in the European towns, which left the parallel Egyptian towns out of the loop. Still worse, with the opening of the Suez Canal, there was no longer a need for a large Egyptian workforce. Thus, the Egyptian towns along the Suez drowned in poverty, unemployment, and misery. The only way to escape their desolation was to assimilate in either French or English. As such, some segments of the Egyptian communities abandoned their indigenous culture and desperately tried to learn foreign languages, morals, and customs. The price for assimilating into a European culture was to become a second-tier subject in the British-French towns. Hassan Al-Banna lived in one such poverty-stricken Egyptian town by the Suez, and he witnessed firsthand how distinctly different the European and Islamic civilizations were, and how his fellow Egyptians turned their backs on their Islamic heritage. The scene was humiliating, deeply so. Al-Banna took personal offense to the decay of Egyptian culture. So in 1927, he established a primary school in a Suez town called Ismailia. There, Al-Banna educated Egyptian kids about their history, heritage, and faith. He lectured about cultural colonialism, foreign influence, injustice, and so on. The point was to teach the future generation about self-respect and dignity, and much of the curriculum was inspired by the previous generation of Islamic scholars, including Jamaluddin al-Afghani. The lectures of Al-Banna were so gripping that teenagers and their fathers started dropping in as well. The attendance got so big that Al-Banna began offering evening programs for adults and renamed his school as the Muslim Brotherhood. From 1928 onwards, the group grew larger still. Soon enough, the Muslim Brotherhood opened new centers along the Suez. By the 1930s, the Brotherhood had grown into a nationwide fraternity for men, with thousands of loyal, educated, and capable members across Egypt. It wasn't long until the Muslim Brotherhood moved into the political arena and declared the westernized elite in Cairo and Alexandria as the primary foe of the country. What's more, since the westernized Egyptian elite espoused secularism and nationalism, these two ideas were viewed as incompatible with Islam. Instead, Al-Banna and his followers preached for pan-Islamism, where they called for Islamic solidarity and unity. This was a powerful message, especially since the Ottoman Empire had collapsed only a few years earlier. So there was a yearning for some sort of Islamic unity, and Al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood spoke to that passion. Going by this narrative, the Brotherhood viewed the space extending from Libya to Syria as a singular entity, and they called on other pan-Islamic groups to forge similar designs. At around the same time that the Muslim Brotherhood was taking shape, much of the world was going through its own revolutionary phase. The United States was struggling to keep afloat during the Great Depression, the Nazis were taking over the government in Germany, and Stalin was cementing his hold on the Soviet Union. Outside of Egypt, nobody had ever heard of the Muslim Brotherhood. That worldview started to change from 1946 onwards. Members of the Brotherhood took up arms and started armed operations against British interests, with the goal being to expel the colonial rule in Egypt. Meanwhile, as westernization and industrialization continued across the country, the Egyptian working class kept on growing. In turn, more Egyptians turned to the Muslim Brotherhood for guidance. It is estimated that in 1948, the Brotherhood had over 2,000 local branches and roughly 500,000 members and sympathizers. They had constructed schools, hospitals, pharmacies, mosques all over Egypt, and their esteem had flourished as a result. So the Muslim Brotherhood was by no means just a militant group. Its growth represented a cultural battle for the soul of Egypt. Navigating through this cultural minefield was hazardous, and Al-Banna believed that his organization had to prepare for the battle to come. They inscribed the motto "Prepare" in their coat of arms and condemned ideas such as secularism and nationalism. Sensing conflict on the horizon, the Egyptian Prime Minister Mahmoud al-Noqrashi Pasha officially disbanded the Brotherhood in 1948, impounded its assets, and detained many of its core members. However, in the same year, a member of the Brotherhood gunned down Noqrashi Pasha. The gunman likely acted on his own because Al-Banna immediately condemned the assassination. However, at the time, the situation was extraordinarily tense because Egypt had joined the Arab League in the war against Israel, so the Cairo government would indulge no second guessing and retaliated by assassinating the founder Al-Banna. King Farouk had lured Al-Banna into the open by promising a peaceful resolution, only for Al-Banna to be gunned down in the street. It was a major loss for the Muslim Brotherhood, but the act triggered a nationwide insurgency. In the next few years, the Muslim Brotherhood mobilized its members to overthrow the monarchy and government, with open rebellion in the streets of the capital. Be that as it may, neither side had the decisive upper hand. By 1952, the Muslim Brotherhood switched tactics and conspired with an elite group of Egyptian military officers to overthrow the monarchy. The execution was near flawless, and the constitutional monarchy of King Farouk was abolished. Egypt declared itself a republic, Britain left the area, and the leading officer, Mohamed Naguib, became its president. As soon as the military officers settled into power, they turned against each other. Gamal Abdel Nasser accused Mohamed Naguib of sympathizing with the Muslim Brotherhood and forced him to resign from the presidency in 1954. Nasser was then sworn in as the new president. While delivering a speech in Alexandria, which was being broadcast to the Arab world by radio, a gunman of the Muslim Brotherhood fired shots at Nasser, but all missed him. Panic broke out among the audience, but Nasser maintained his posture and reassured the public of his commitment and resolve. All this happened while the radio broadcast was still on air. It was a stunning display of courage, and it propelled Nasser to the forefront of the entire Arab world. With the Egyptian public sympathizing with Nasser, the new president abolished the Muslim Brotherhood and imprisoned thousands of its members. This act nearly destroyed the Brotherhood as a functioning organization.
أنا في رأيي إن كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام. فقال لي لا أنت باعتبارك الحاكم مسؤول. قلت له يا أستاذ أنت ليك بنت في كلية الطب مش لابسة طرحة ولا حاجة. ما لبستهاش طرحة ليه؟ ده كنت أنت. إذا كنت أنت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحدة اللي هي بنتك طرح، عايزنا ننزل ألبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد.
It wasn't until the 1970s that the group made a comeback when they assassinated Egypt's third president, Anwar Sadat. The Cairo government retaliated for the assassination, but during this period, the Muslim Brotherhood became somewhat of a covert tool for the government's domestic policies. Whenever Cairo needed to silence someone or make people disappear, they called in the Brotherhood. This newfound relationship between the Cairo government and the Muslim Brotherhood remained an uneasy balance. Over the decades, the two would occasionally hit back at each other, only for the other to retaliate. Military officers were assassinated, Brotherhood members were held for trial and executed, and so on. Eventually though, the armed ethos of the Muslim Brotherhood underwent a fundamental change. To regain the trust and confidence of the Egyptian public, the Brotherhood started adapting a policy of non-violence as a means to achieve its goals. Violence was only used for defensive purposes, not to overthrow the government. Not everyone agreed with the non-violence policy, and some core members parted ways and organized new splinter groups that carried on the armed struggle. One such splinter group was Hamas, now active in the Gaza Strip. Overall though, the bulk of the Muslim Brotherhood remained faithful to the non-violence policy, using violence only to defend themselves. Over the next few decades, as the Cairo government became increasingly authoritarian in its pursuits, political opposition found a safe haven among the Muslim Brotherhood. So by the 1980s, during the reign of Hosni Mubarak, the Brotherhood had reinvented itself as an umbrella institution for political opposition. Public sympathy towards the organization grew drastically. By the turn of the millennium, it was experiencing a revival in Egypt. This change in public sentiment is what allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to claim power in 2011 when it won several elections in Egypt, including the 2012 presidential election. As a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohamed Morsi became Egypt's first president to gain power through an election, though a year later he was overthrown by the military following massive demonstrations in Cairo. Today, the Muslim Brotherhood is once again outlawed in Egypt, and some of its affiliate divisions in the Arab world are banned as well. Still, with millions of members across the Middle East, the pan-Islamic message of the Muslim Brotherhood continues to resonate far beyond its indigenous base of operations. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and Sahul.